The 1950s gave America some incredible cars, but it also produced some absolutely terrible ideas. These 7 were supposed to succeed, yet something went horribly wrong. And some of them are so strange, you won't believe they were actually sold.
Number 1. 1951 Henry J. The first time I saw the 1951 Henry J, I honestly couldn't believe someone had actually sold this as a normal American car. At first glance, it just looks like a small and simple sedan, but the more I learned about it, the more I started wondering who would actually choose this car when much larger and more comfortable American cars were available for only a little more money. The Henry J was created with one main idea in mind: build an inexpensive car that ordinary Americans could afford. That sounds reasonable, especially in the years after World War II, when demand for affordable transportation was growing. But Kaiser Frazer, the company behind the Henry J, had to cut costs wherever it could, and they really cut them. When I started looking at the details, that's when the car became much stranger. For example, the trunk didn't have a conventional outside opening like you would expect from a normal sedan. To get into the luggage area, you had to fold down the rear seat. That might sound like a small inconvenience, but imagine actually using this car every day. You buy groceries, luggage, tools, or anything else you need to carry, and instead of simply opening the trunk, you're reaching through the passenger compartment. Then there were the rear windows. They didn't roll down normally. They were fixed in place. Again, it was done to save money, but when you compare the Henry J with a typical American sedan of the early 1950s, it starts to feel less like a normal car and more like a collection of compromises. And that's what really surprised me. America in the early 1950s wasn't exactly known for tiny, stripped-down automobiles. The big manufacturers were producing cars with large bodies, comfortable interiors, powerful engines, chrome everywhere, and plenty of space for passengers. Then there was the Henry J. It was small, it was basic, it was built around the idea that people would accept fewer features in exchange for a lower price. The problem was that the price difference wasn't always large enough to make all those compromises worthwhile. That's where the story gets interesting. The Henry J was designed by Kaiser Frazer and was named after Henry J. Kaiser. The company wanted to create a low-cost automobile that could compete for buyers who couldn't afford the larger cars from Ford and Chevrolet. On paper, that sounds like a smart strategy, but the American car market was a difficult place for a small manufacturer. People didn't just buy transportation, they bought size, they bought comfort, they bought style, they bought status. And American manufacturers had become very good at giving customers a lot of car for their money. So when someone walked into a dealership and looked at the Henry J, they had to ask themselves a pretty simple question: why should I buy this? If you wanted a basic car, the Henry J made sense. But if you could spend a little more and get a larger Ford or Chevrolet, suddenly the advantages became harder to see. That's the biggest problem the Henry J faced. It was trying to compete on price in a market where larger cars were already relatively affordable, and that is a difficult position. The Henry J was also powered by small 6- and 4-cylinder engines depending on the version, which made it much less powerful than the larger American cars people were used to. Again, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The smaller engine meant lower fuel consumption and lower operating costs, but American buyers were becoming accustomed to bigger engines and effortless performance. The Henry J couldn't compete with that. It wasn't supposed to. It was supposed to be inexpensive transportation. But sometimes being inexpensive isn't enough. A car has to make sense to the buyer. And that's where the Henry J struggled. I can imagine someone walking into a dealership in 1951. They see the Henry J, it's smaller, it's simpler, it doesn't have many of the features found on larger cars. Then they look at another showroom car that's bigger, more comfortable, and much more impressive. Maybe the difference in price isn't enormous. At that point, the Henry J becomes a difficult choice, and I think that's why the car is so fascinating today. It shows how difficult it was to build a truly inexpensive American car during this period. The idea was good, the execution was extremely aggressive in cutting costs, but the American market wasn't necessarily ready to accept that level of compromise. And the Henry J wasn't ugly in the traditional sense. That's actually part of what makes it interesting. The exterior was relatively clean and simple. There wasn't anything particularly outrageous about the shape. If you saw one from a distance, you might think it was simply a smaller American sedan. But once you learned what was missing, the whole car started to look different. The lack of a conventional trunk opening, the fixed rear windows, the basic interior, the small engine, all of these details told the same story. Kaiser was trying to remove everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. The goal was to get the price down. And in some ways, that's exactly what makes the Henry J such a fascinating example of American automotive history. It wasn't trying to impress you. It wasn't trying to be luxurious. It wasn't trying to win a race. It was trying to be affordable. But the strange thing is that even an affordable car still has to compete with everything else on the market, and that's where the Henry J ran into trouble. The car also had an interesting connection to Sears, where it was sold under the Allstate name for a short period, which tells you how hard Kaiser was trying to find new ways to sell the car and reach buyers. But even with those efforts, the Henry J never became the huge success Kaiser needed. And when I think about that, I understand why. The idea of a cheap American car sounds great until you compare it directly with the alternatives. If the customer is already spending money on a new automobile, they want to feel like they've gotten something substantial. They want to sit inside and feel like they've bought a real new car. They want space. They want comfort. They want features. They want something they can be proud of. The Henry J was almost the opposite. It was basically saying, you don't need all that. And maybe that was the problem. American buyers often wanted more, not less. The Henry J was also entering the market at a time when the big three were incredibly powerful. Ford and Chevrolet had enormous dealer networks. They had established reputations. They had huge production capabilities. They could build cars in massive numbers and spread development costs across millions of vehicles. Kaiser didn't have that same advantage, so the Henry J had to be very careful about cost. And every cost-saving decision made the car less competitive against the larger manufacturers. That's the irony. The company made the car simpler so it could compete on price, but those same compromises made customers more likely to choose something else. It's almost a perfect example of how difficult it is to build a cheap car that people actually want. And that's why I find the Henry J much more interesting than its plain appearance suggests. It wasn't simply a forgotten little sedan. It was an experiment in trying to change the American automobile market. Kaiser was asking whether Americans would sacrifice size and features to get a cheaper new car. The answer turned out to be complicated. Some buyers were interested, but not enough of them were willing to make the compromises. And that tells us something important about American car culture at the beginning of the 1950s. Americans were already becoming accustomed to big automobiles. The post-war economy was creating new opportunities for consumers. Cars were becoming symbols of success and freedom. People wanted their new cars to feel better than the cars they had before. The Henry J went in the opposite direction. It offered less, and that's why it was such a difficult sell. The more I learned about it, the more I realized that the Henry J wasn't necessarily a bad idea. It was simply a difficult idea to sell in the American market. A small, cheap car can work extremely well in some countries, but America had different expectations. There was plenty of land. I see one of the boldest attempts to make a truly stripped-down American car at a time when almost everything else was getting bigger, flashier, and more comfortable. And honestly, I'm still surprised that someone thought Americans would look at all those missing features and say, yes, that's exactly the car I want.
Number 2. 1953 Hudson Jet. The first time I learned about the 1953 Hudson Jet, I couldn't understand how Hudson expected this little car to save the company. The idea itself sounded reasonable.
Hudson needed a smaller car that could compete with Ford and Chevrolet, attract new buyers, and bring much-needed money into the company. But when I looked at what Hudson actually built, I started to see why the plan went so badly. The Jet was supposed to be Hudson's answer to the growing popularity of smaller cars. Instead of forcing customers to buy a huge American sedan, Hudson wanted to offer something more compact and economical. On paper, that should have been a smart move. But there was one huge problem. The Jet wasn't cheap enough, and that made almost everything else about the car much harder to justify. Hudson spent a tremendous amount of money developing the Jet, and the company was taking a major risk by investing so heavily in a smaller automobile. The problem was that Hudson didn't have the enormous production capacity of Ford or Chevrolet, so it couldn't spread those development costs across millions of cars. That meant every Jet had to carry part of that expensive development program in its price. And once buyers saw the price, the situation became uncomfortable. Why buy a small Hudson when you could spend not much more money and get a much larger American car? That was the question Hudson couldn't escape. The Jet itself wasn't necessarily a terrible automobile. It was reasonably solid, and Hudson gave it a 6-cylinder engine that was more substantial than you might expect from such a small car. But the problem wasn't simply the mechanical package, it was the value. American buyers were used to getting a lot of car for their money. They wanted space, they wanted comfort, they wanted style. They wanted a big automobile sitting in their driveway. The Jet was smaller, but it didn't provide a dramatic enough price advantage to make people forget what they were giving up. And that's where I think Hudson made one of its biggest mistakes. The company tried to compete with the smaller cars without having the financial strength or production scale necessary to make that strategy work. The Jet had to be economical, but it also had to recover Hudson's enormous investment. Those two goals were fighting each other. And the more I looked into the story, the more I realized just how risky this project had been. Hudson was already struggling. The company didn't have unlimited money. It needed a successful new model. And instead of simply updating an existing car, Hudson invested heavily in creating an entirely new compact automobile. The stakes were enormous. If the Jet succeeded, it could have given Hudson a much-needed new market. If it failed, the company would be left with fewer resources and even bigger problems. Unfortunately for Hudson, the second scenario happened. The styling didn't help either. The Jet wasn't hideous, but compared with the larger Hudsons of the period, it lacked the dramatic presence that had made the company interesting. Hudson's famous step-down cars had a distinctive low-slung appearance and unusual proportions. The Jet was much more conventional. It looked like a smaller sedan. And when you're asking customers to choose a smaller car instead of a big American automobile, the smaller car needs to give them something special. The Jet struggled to do that. I think that's what makes the story so frustrating. The company had some genuinely innovative ideas. The company had built some of the most interesting American cars of the early post-war period. It had a strong engineering reputation. It had racing success. It had the Hornet. It had a loyal customer base. But the Jet was supposed to solve a much bigger financial problem than a single car could realistically fix, and Hudson desperately needed it to succeed. Imagine the pressure inside the company. Millions of dollars had already been invested. The new model had to attract buyers. Dealers needed something they could sell, and Hudson needed the money from those sales to keep moving forward. Then customers walked into the showroom and compared the Jet with the alternatives. They could look at a small Hudson, then they could look at a larger Ford, then a Chevrolet, then maybe a Plymouth, and suddenly the Jet didn't look like such a bargain. That's the part I find most interesting. The car wasn't necessarily failing because it was unreliable or impossible to drive. It was failing because the market simply didn't see enough reason to choose it. And that's sometimes even harder for an automobile company to fix. You can improve an engine, you can redesign a body, you can add features. But if customers fundamentally don't see the value in the product, you're in serious trouble. Hudson tried to improve the Jet, but the basic problem remained. The car was too expensive to compete as a cheap compact and too small to compete against the larger American cars that buyers were accustomed to. It was caught in the middle. And being caught in the middle is a dangerous place for any automobile. The Jet also arrived during a period when the American industry was changing quickly. The early 1950s were becoming increasingly competitive. The Big Three were getting stronger. Production numbers were enormous. New styling appeared almost every year. Customers were being encouraged to trade in their cars frequently, and manufacturers with limited resources were struggling to keep up. Hudson simply didn't have the same financial power. That made the Jet project even more dangerous. The company needed volume, but it couldn't achieve the kind of volume necessary to make the car truly profitable. And without strong profits, Hudson couldn't keep funding new products. It's almost like the Jet became trapped in a cycle. Hudson needed the car to sell well, but the car needed a competitive price to sell well. And Hudson couldn't offer that competitive price because the development costs were so high and production volume was too low. That's a terrible position for a manufacturer. And unfortunately, the Jet became a symbol of that problem. The strangest thing is that if Hudson had been a much larger company, the story might have been completely different. A giant manufacturer could have spent millions developing a compact car and then produced hundreds of thousands of them. The development cost would have been spread across a huge number of vehicles. Hudson couldn't do that. Every Jet mattered, every dollar mattered, and every unsold car hurt. That's why the Jet's failure wasn't simply about one unpopular model. It was part of a much bigger financial crisis. Hudson needed a miracle. The Jet wasn't that miracle. And when I look at the car today, that's what makes it so fascinating. It represents a moment when a struggling American manufacturer made one enormous gamble. The company looked at the market and said, "We need a smaller car." But it didn't fully solve the more difficult question: how do we make a smaller car that Americans actually want to buy instead of a larger car? That was the real challenge, and Hudson never found the answer. The Jet did have some qualities that made it interesting. It was compact for its time, it had a 6-cylinder engine, it was reasonably easy to maneuver compared with the huge American cars around it, and for someone who genuinely wanted a smaller automobile, it could make sense. But the American market was unforgiving. People weren't simply comparing the Jet with other small cars, they were comparing it with everything. And when the price difference became too small, many buyers simply chose the bigger car. That's probably the most important lesson from the Jet. A small car doesn't automatically become attractive just because it's smaller. It needs to offer a compelling reason to accept the compromises. But instead of saving the company, the Jet became one more warning sign that Hudson's future was becoming extremely difficult. And when you realize how much money and hope Hudson had placed behind this little car, it makes the Jet story even harder to forget.
Number 3. 1952 Allstate. The first time I heard that Sears was selling its own car, I honestly thought someone had made the story up. When you think of Sears in the 1950s, you probably imagine tools, appliances, clothing, household products, and the famous Sears catalog. But an automobile? That sounds completely different. Yet it actually happened. In 1952, Sears introduced the Allstate, a small American car that was essentially based on the Kaiser Frazer Henry J. The idea was surprisingly simple. Take an existing automobile, give it Allstate branding, and sell it through Sears. At first, that sounds like a pretty clever business idea. Sears already had millions of customers, it had stores across the country, it had an enormous catalog business. People trusted the company for everything from household appliances to automotive parts. So why not sell them a car? That's probably what Sears was thinking. But the automobile business turned out to be much harder than selling a washing machine or a set of tools. And that's where the Allstate story gets really interesting. The Allstate wasn't designed from the beginning as a completely independent automobile. It was based on the Henry J, the small car developed by Kaiser Frazer as an affordable alternative to the much larger American cars of the early 1950s. Sears essentially took that basic car and created its own version. There were changes to the styling, trim, equipment, and branding, but underneath, the Allstate was closely related to the Henry J. And that's important because the Henry J already had a difficult position in the American market. It was small, it was basic, and it was trying to compete with much larger cars. Now imagine taking that same basic concept and trying to sell it through a department store chain. That's where things get complicated.
Sears already had experience selling automotive products. People could buy tires, batteries, tools, and other car-related equipment from Sears. But buying an entire automobile was completely different. A car isn't something you simply put in a shopping cart. You need dealers, you need test drives, you need service, you need financing, you need parts, you need trained mechanics, you need somewhere for the customer to return when something goes wrong. Sears was entering a business with an enormous amount of infrastructure behind it, and the Allstate had to compete against Ford, Chevrolet, Plymouth, and other established brands that already had huge dealer networks. That's a very difficult position. But the most fascinating part is imagining what it must have been like to buy one. You could walk into Sears and essentially encounter an automobile carrying the same brand name you associated with your household purchases. The Allstate badge wasn't just a coincidence. It was Sears trying to create a complete automotive identity, and I find that incredibly strange. Today, imagine walking into a huge retail store and seeing a brand new car sitting inside. Not just a display, an actual car you could buy. That's basically what Sears was trying to do. The Allstate was introduced for the 1952 model year and continued into 1953, but the experiment was short-lived. After only 2 model years, Sears stopped selling it. And when you look at the circumstances, you can start to understand why. The car wasn't dramatically different from other inexpensive American cars. It didn't have a powerful engine, it wasn't luxurious, it wasn't particularly large, and it didn't offer buyers a huge advantage over the competition. So Sears had to convince customers to choose an unfamiliar automobile brand from a company that wasn't traditionally an automobile manufacturer. That's a difficult sales pitch. Imagine walking into a Sears store. You need a new car. On one side, you can buy a Chevrolet from an established Chevrolet dealer. On another side, you can buy a Ford. And then someone says, "Why don't you buy this Sears car?" It's a fascinating question. Maybe the rear's reputation made the idea interesting. Maybe the convenience appealed to some people. But buying a car is a major purchase. Customers wanted to know what would happen 5 years later. Where would they take it for service? Would parts be available? Would the car hold its value? Would the company still be selling it? Those concerns matter, and Allstate had very little history to reassure buyers. The car also suffered from the basic problem that affected the Henry J. It was trying to be inexpensive, but American buyers had plenty of choices, and those choices were often bigger. Americans were becoming accustomed to large cars with comfortable interiors and powerful engines. The Allstate was much more modest. It was essentially asking customers to accept a smaller, simpler automobile. That might have worked if the price difference had been dramatic, but it wasn't always enough. And that's what makes the story so frustrating. The concept itself wasn't crazy. In fact, Sears had enormous advantages. The company had a massive customer base, it had a trusted name, it had an existing automotive business, it already sold replacement parts and accessories, it had stores all over the country. On paper, the Allstate could have become an interesting new way to sell automobiles. But the automobile itself wasn't special enough to overcome the disadvantages. That's the part I keep coming back to. If Sears had created a truly unique car, maybe customers would have been more interested. But instead, the Allstate was closely related to an existing low-cost car. So why choose the Sears version? That was the challenge. The Allstate did have its own styling details and equipment, but it wasn't revolutionary. It looked like a small, early 1950s American sedan. And in a market filled with new designs every year, simply being available through Sears wasn't enough. The Allstate also entered the market at an awkward time. The American automobile industry was incredibly competitive. The major manufacturers were constantly updating their cars. New styling was appearing rapidly, cars were becoming more attractive and more powerful. Customers were being encouraged to replace their automobiles frequently. Against that environment, a small Sears-branded car had a difficult job. It needed to stand out. Instead, it looked like an alternative to the alternatives. And that's probably why the experiment ended so quickly. After the 1953 model year, Sears abandoned the Allstate. The company had spent time and money developing the idea, but the sales weren't strong enough to justify continuing. And just like that, Sears went back to selling the products it was already famous for. The Allstate became a tiny footnote in American automotive history. But honestly, I think that's what makes it so fascinating.
It's not just another forgotten car, it's a forgotten business experiment. Sears was one of America's biggest retailers. It had the money, it had the customers, it had the distribution network. And yet, even Sears couldn't simply walk into the automobile market and make the idea work. That tells you how difficult the car business really was. And there's another interesting detail. Because the Allstate was based on the Henry J, its story is connected to another unusual American experiment. The Henry J was trying to create a cheap car. The Allstate was trying to sell that idea through one of America's largest retail companies. So you essentially had two unusual ideas stacked on top of each other. A stripped-down small American car sold through Sears. It sounds almost too strange to be real, but it was. And that's exactly why I think the Allstate deserves to be remembered. It's one of those cars that immediately makes you stop and ask a question. Why would Sears build a car? And then you learn the answer. Sears didn't really build it from scratch. It took the Henry J concept and created its own branded version. But even that was a bold move, because Sears was trying to turn its enormous retail presence into an advantage in the automobile business. The company understood that Americans already trusted Sears. If they trusted Sears for tools, appliances, clothing, and automotive equipment, maybe they would trust Sears for a car too. It was logical. But customers didn't respond strongly enough. And that's an important lesson. Brand recognition can get people to look at a product. The Allstate disappeared, and today it remains one of the strangest examples of what can happen when a giant American retailer decides it wants to sell cars.
Number 4. 1952 Willys Aero. The first time I saw the 1952 Willys Aero, I honestly had to look twice. When I hear the name Willys, I immediately think of Jeeps, military vehicles, rugged off-road machines, and those simple, boxy bodies that could survive almost anything. I never expected to see a Willys that looked like this. The Aero was completely different. It was a sleek little American sedan with a smooth body, low roofline, and surprisingly modern proportions. Instead of looking like something designed for dirt roads or military service, it looked like Willys was trying to build a stylish passenger car for ordinary American families. And that was exactly what the company was trying to do. But there was one major problem. The timing couldn't have been worse. America was entering an era when bigger cars were becoming more desirable, engines were getting more powerful, and manufacturers were competing to give buyers more chrome, more space, and more performance. Then Willys arrived with this relatively small sedan and basically asked Americans to consider something simpler. That's a difficult argument to make in 1952. The Aero itself was actually a pretty interesting car. Willys had experience building compact vehicles, and the company wanted to create something that could compete in the growing passenger car market without trying to copy the enormous automobiles coming from Detroit. The Aero had a relatively low body and clean styling that made it look much more sophisticated than I expected from Willys. It didn't look like a Jeep, it didn't look like a military vehicle, and it didn't look like the typical tall, heavy American sedan of the early 1950s. It had a much more streamlined appearance. The roof was lower, the body was smoother, the proportions were compact. And from certain angles, it almost looked like a smaller version of the larger American cars that were becoming popular. That's what makes the story so interesting. Willys was clearly trying to prove that it could build more than just rugged utility vehicles. The company wanted a place in the normal American passenger car market, and the Aero was its attempt to get there. But when you look at the American market in 1952, you can understand the problem almost immediately. People were starting to want bigger cars. The post-war economy was changing. Families had more purchasing power. American manufacturers were constantly introducing larger and more powerful models. V8 engines were becoming an increasingly important selling point, and styling was becoming a huge part of the buying decision. A new car wasn't simply transportation anymore. It was something people wanted to show off. They wanted their new car to look impressive. They wanted it to feel modern. They wanted more space than the car they owned before, and they wanted to know that they were moving forward. The Aero was going in a slightly different direction. It was smaller, it was lighter, it was more economical, and it didn't try to overwhelm you with size. That might sound like an advantage today, but in 1952 America, it wasn't necessarily what most buyers were looking for. That's the part that makes the Aero's story so frustrating. The car itself wasn't necessarily the problem, the market was. Imagine walking into a showroom in 1952. You have a certain amount of money to spend. You look at the Willys Aero. It's compact and attractive. Then you look at a larger Ford, maybe a Chevrolet, maybe a Plymouth. Suddenly, you realize that for not dramatically more money, you can get a much bigger automobile. More room, more presence, more luggage space, and increasingly, more engine. The Aero had to convince you that you didn't need all of that. That's a difficult sales pitch to make, especially in America. And Willys was facing another problem. The company was still strongly associated with Jeeps. That reputation was valuable, but it also created a strange situation. When people heard Willys, they probably thought about rugged utility vehicles. Now, Willys wanted those same customers to think about a sleek family sedan. That's a very different image. The Aero was essentially asking Willys customers to see the company in a completely new way, and I'm not sure enough people were ready to do that. The car did have some interesting engineering behind it. Willys continued to use its efficient 4-cylinder engines, which gave the Aero a different character from the big V8-powered cars that were beginning to dominate the market. That could be an advantage if you wanted something economical and relatively inexpensive to operate. But again, the problem was perception. Americans weren't simply asking whether the car could get them from one place to another. They were comparing it with the increasingly impressive automobiles coming from the major manufacturers. A small 4-cylinder engine might be perfectly adequate, but when the car next to it had a big engine and a much larger body, the Aero could suddenly feel like the compromise. And that's where I think Willys struggled. The Aero was trying to sell the idea of enough space, enough power, enough comfort, enough car. But the American automobile industry was increasingly selling the opposite idea. More horsepower, more chrome, more size, more features, more style. And that created a serious problem for a company like Willys. The Aero wasn't entering a market where small cars were automatically celebrated. It was entering a market where large cars were becoming part of American culture. That's why the Aero looks almost strangely modern today. When I see it now, I can appreciate the compact dimensions and clean design. It doesn't look ridiculous, it doesn't look cheap, it actually looks quite elegant for its time. But if you put it beside a huge American sedan from the same year, you immediately understand the challenge. The Aero looks like the sensible choice, the other car looks like the exciting choice, and buyers don't always choose the sensible car, especially when they're buying something as expensive and emotional as a new automobile. That's another thing that makes the Aero interesting. It was trying to be rational at a time when American car design was becoming increasingly emotional. Manufacturers were using styling to sell dreams. The car in the driveway represented success. It represented freedom. It represented progress. And bigger cars often communicated that feeling better than a small sedan. Willys couldn't compete with that simply by offering efficiency. The company needed a strong identity for the Aero, and while the design was attractive, it wasn't enough to completely change the way people thought about Willys. The Aero also arrived at a difficult moment for smaller American manufacturers. Companies like Ford and Chevrolet had enormous resources. They could introduce new models, change styling frequently, offer different engines, and spread production costs across huge numbers of vehicles. Willys didn't have that luxury. Every new model was a major investment, every production decision mattered, and the company needed the Aero to succeed. It wasn't just another experiment, it was an attempt to establish Willys as a serious passenger car manufacturer. That's a lot of pressure to put on one small sedan. And the more I learned about it, the more I understood why the car eventually disappeared. The Aero wasn't necessarily a failure because it was badly designed. It was a victim of the direction the American market was taking. And that's a much more interesting story. Sometimes a car can be perfectly reasonable and still fail. Maybe the product arrives too early. Maybe it arrives too late. Maybe customers simply want something completely different. The Aero was caught in exactly that situation. It was offering a smaller and more economical alternative, while the rest of the industry was moving to bigger and more powerful cars. That's almost like trying to swim against the current, and Willys eventually had to recognize that. The company continued developing the Aero through the 1950s, but its passenger car ambitions became increasingly difficult to sustain. The market was consolidating, competition was becoming tougher, and Willys ultimately returned its focus towards the area where it had a much stronger identity. And looking at it today, I honestly think that's what makes the car so fascinating. It wasn't too strange to understand. It was simply too different from what America wanted at that moment.
Number 5. 1954 Kaiser Manhattan. The first time I saw the 1954 Kaiser Manhattan, I couldn't understand why this car didn't become a bigger success. It didn't look cheap or unfinished. In fact, it looked surprisingly expensive. Kaiser gave it elegant styling, a comfortable interior, and plenty of features that were supposed to make it feel like a serious American luxury car. And that's what makes the story so frustrating. The Manhattan looked like it had everything it needed to compete, but the company behind it was fighting an almost impossible battle. By 1954, the American automobile market was dominated by giants. Ford and Chevrolet had enormous production numbers and massive dealer networks. Chrysler had powerful engines and increasingly impressive styling. General Motors had several brands covering almost every price level. Then there was Kaiser, a much smaller manufacturer trying to convince Americans to spend their money on a car from a company that didn't have the same history, resources, or market presence as the big manufacturers. That was already a huge disadvantage, and the Manhattan was supposed to help change that. When I look at the car, I can understand why Kaiser had so much hope for it. The styling was smooth and confident. It had the kind of long, elegant body that made it look more expensive than some of Kaiser's earlier cars. There was plenty of chrome, a carefully designed interior, and a general feeling that Kaiser was trying to move into a more upscale market. This wasn't supposed to be a cheap transportation car. Kaiser wanted the Manhattan to feel special. And in some ways, it succeeded. The car had a distinctive appearance that separated it from many ordinary sedans. It didn't simply look like a basic family car with some extra chrome added. It had its own identity. And that's why I think the failure is so interesting. Because when a terrible car fails, you can understand it. When a car is unreliable, ugly, or completely impractical, the story is easy. But what happens when a car actually looks pretty good and still can't survive? That's what happened with the 1954 Kaiser Manhattan. The problem wasn't simply the car, it was everything around it. Kaiser was trying to compete in a business where size mattered enormously. Ford could sell huge numbers of cars, Chevrolet could sell huge numbers of cars, GM could spread its engineering costs across multiple brands. Chrysler had a long-established reputation. Kaiser didn't have those advantages. Every new model was a major financial gamble. Every design change cost money. Every production run needed enough buyers to justify the investment. And that becomes especially difficult when you're trying to sell a luxury-oriented automobile. Because luxury customers aren't just buying transportation, they're buying confidence. They want to know that the company will still be around. They want a strong dealer network. They want easy access to parts and service. They want their expensive car to hold its value. And Kaiser had trouble giving customers that sense of security. That's where the Manhattan story becomes much more complicated. The car itself could be attractive, but buyers weren't just comparing it with another Kaiser. They were comparing it with everything else available. Imagine having enough money for a new car in 1954. You walk into a Kaiser showroom and see the Manhattan. It's attractive, it's comfortable, it's well-equipped. Then you go look at a Ford, then a Chevrolet, then maybe a Buick, Oldsmobile, or Chrysler. Suddenly, Kaiser has a problem. The Manhattan may be interesting, but the other companies have enormous advantages.
They have established reputations, they have more dealers, they have more models, they have bigger advertising budgets, and they can introduce new styling every year. Kaiser had to fight much harder for every customer, and that makes the Manhattan situation almost unfair. The car was trying to prove itself in a market where the competition had already been established for decades. But Kaiser wasn't giving up. The company kept trying to make the Manhattan more attractive. More equipment, more luxury, more visual appeal, more reasons for customers to take a chance on the brand. But eventually, the numbers became impossible to ignore. Sales were falling. The company was losing its ability to compete in the American passenger car market, and the Manhattan couldn't change that by itself. That's the part I find most fascinating. The car was almost being asked to perform a miracle. Kaiser needed it to attract buyers, generate money, strengthen the brand, and help keep the passenger car business alive. That's far too much responsibility for one model. And the market wasn't going to give Kaiser extra time simply because the Manhattan was attractive. If buyers didn't show up, the company still had to pay for factories, workers, engineering, advertising, dealerships, and development. Every month mattered. Every sale mattered. And when sales collapsed, the entire passenger car operation became increasingly difficult to justify. The Manhattan, therefore, became one of Kaiser's final serious attempts to remain a major American passenger car manufacturer. And when you look at it today, that's what makes the car so much more interesting than its simple appearance suggests. You're not just looking at an old sedan. You're looking at one of the last chapters of a company trying desperately to survive in an industry that was becoming almost impossible for smaller manufacturers. Kaiser entered the American automobile business with enormous ambition. The company believed it could compete with established manufacturers. It introduced new designs, it experimented with different ideas, it tried to give customers modern automobiles without simply copying the competition. And for a while, Kaiser had a real presence. But the automobile industry was brutal. Being innovative wasn't enough. Being well-equipped wasn't enough. Having attractive styling wasn't enough. You needed enormous scale. You needed money, you needed production efficiency, you needed dealers everywhere. And you could still lose everything. That is exactly what makes the 1954 Kaiser Manhattan such a fascinating, forgotten American car. Number 6. 1957 Packard Clipper. The first time I looked at the 1957 Packard Clipper, I honestly wasn't sure what I was looking at. It had the Packard name, but something about the car felt different. It didn't have the same presence I expected from a traditional Packard. And the more I learned about it, the more I realized that the confusion wasn't just in my head. Packard itself was in serious trouble. By 1957, one of America's most respected luxury car names was fighting to survive, and the Clipper was caught right in the middle of that crisis. That's what makes this car so interesting. The Packard name had once meant something special. For decades, Packard had been associated with expensive automobiles, elegant engineering, powerful engines, and wealthy customers who wanted something more prestigious than an ordinary Ford or Chevrolet. Packard had built a reputation that allowed it to compete with some of the biggest luxury manufacturers in America. But by the 1950s, the situation had changed dramatically. The American automobile industry was becoming dominated by huge corporations. General Motors had Cadillac, Buick, and Oldsmobile. Ford had Lincoln and Mercury. Chrysler had Imperial. These companies could spend enormous amounts of money developing new cars every few years. Packard simply didn't have the same resources, and that became a serious problem. Packard was trying to compete in the luxury market while the major manufacturers were becoming larger and more powerful. The company needed money, it needed sales, it needed new products. And eventually, Packard merged with Studebaker in an attempt to create a stronger automobile company. But instead of immediately solving Packard's problems, the merger created a whole new set of complications. And that's where the 1957 Packard Clipper enters the story. The name Clipper itself had a long history with Packard. The original Clipper had been introduced before World War II and became one of Packard's most recognizable designs. It was sleek, modern, and different from many traditional Packards. So when you hear Packard Clipper, you might expect a prestigious luxury car. But by 1957, the situation was completely different. The name was still there, but the company behind it was struggling to maintain its identity. The Clipper became part of that problem. It was difficult to tell exactly where Packard ended and Studebaker began. And for a luxury car buyer, that was a dangerous situation. Imagine you've spent years associating Packard with prestige. Then you walk into a showroom and see a car wearing the Packard name that looks much closer to the products coming from Studebaker. You might start asking questions. Is this really a Packard? Is it still a luxury automobile? Why does it look so different? And most importantly, why should I pay more for it? That's the problem Packard was facing. The 1957 Packard Clipper wasn't necessarily a terrible car. The problem was the message it sent. It wasn't clear. And when you're selling a luxury automobile, clarity matters. Customers need to understand why your car is special. They need to feel that they're buying something above the ordinary. Packard had spent decades building exactly that image, but now the company was struggling to maintain it. The Clipper looked like the product of a company that no longer had enough money to control its own future. And in some ways, that's exactly what it was. Packard and Studebaker had combined because both companies were struggling. The idea was that combining their resources would create a stronger competitor, but the reality was much more complicated. Studebaker itself was financially weak. Packard was also struggling. Instead of one healthy company helping another, it became more like two struggling companies trying to survive together. That created enormous pressure, and the automobiles produced during this period reflected that pressure. The 1957 Clipper was part of a lineup that was increasingly difficult to distinguish from Studebaker. That was a major problem for Packard. A luxury brand cannot easily survive if customers stop seeing a meaningful difference between it and a less expensive brand. Think about Cadillac. Even if you don't know much about cars, you understand that Cadillac is supposed to be something above Chevrolet. Lincoln is supposed to be above Ford. Imperial was supposed to represent something more luxurious within Chrysler. Packard needed that same separation. But by 1957, that separation was disappearing. The Clipper name itself became confusing because Packard was using it in a completely different environment. The styling wasn't necessarily ugly. In fact, there were some interesting design elements, but it didn't have the same commanding presence associated with the great Packards of earlier years, and that mattered. Luxury cars were increasingly about visual impact. The American automobile industry was entering the era of huge fins, dramatic chrome, enormous bodies, and increasingly extravagant designs. The Clipper needed to look expensive. Instead, it often looked like a car caught between two identities. It wasn't quite the traditional Packard. It wasn't quite a Studebaker. It was something in between. And that's probably the best way to describe the entire company at that moment. Packard itself was caught in the middle. The company wanted to remain a luxury manufacturer, but financially it was becoming increasingly difficult to operate like one. It needed to use existing platforms and components. It needed to control costs. It needed to share resources. But every cost-saving decision made it harder to maintain the exclusivity of the Packard brand. That's a terrible position for a luxury manufacturer, because the things that save money sometimes destroy the very identity that customers are paying for. And I think that's exactly what happened. The more Packard tried to survive using existing resources and existing technology, the more customers began to question what made a Packard a Packard. The 1957 Packard Clipper became part of that confusion, and the timing couldn't be worse. Packard was already losing customers. The company didn't have the financial strength to keep developing completely new luxury cars at the rate required by the market. Meanwhile, the major manufacturers were spending enormous amounts of money on styling. Every new model year brought dramatic changes. Cars became longer, fins became larger, chrome became more elaborate, engines became more powerful. Customers were constantly being tempted to trade in their old cars for something newer. Packard couldn't keep up, and the Clipper was forced to carry the weight of those problems. That's why I find it unfair to simply call the 1957 Packard Clipper a bad car. It was more like the product of a company running out of options. The engineers and designers could only do so much. They could modify the styling, they could improve equipment, they could make the car more attractive, but they couldn't solve the financial problems of the company. They couldn't instantly restore Packard's reputation, and they couldn't make customers forget that Packard and Studebaker were now connected. That's what makes the car so historically important. It's a snapshot of the moment when Packard was losing its independence and its identity. The name was still there, the badge was still there, but the company behind it was no longer the same Packard that had once built some of America's most prestigious automobiles. And that's something you can almost feel when you look at the car. There's something slightly uncomfortable about it. It looks like it's trying to be a Packard, but at the same time, it looks like something else. And sometimes the cars from the final chapter tell you more about a company than the famous cars from its glory years ever could. Number 7. 1958 DeSoto Fire Sweep. The first time I saw the 1958 DeSoto Fire Sweep, I thought it looked like exactly what a late 1950s American car was supposed to look like. Huge body, plenty of chrome, dramatic fins, and enough styling to make almost anything else on the road look ordinary. But once I learned what was happening behind the scenes at DeSoto, the car became much more interesting. Because the strange thing about the Fire Sweep is that it actually looked successful. It looked expensive. It looked modern. It looked like a car that should have had a bright future. But DeSoto's future was already becoming very uncertain. And the more I looked into the story, the more I realized that the problem wasn't simply the Fire Sweep itself. The problem was where DeSoto fit inside Chrysler's growing lineup. That was becoming increasingly difficult to understand. DeSoto had originally been created by Chrysler as a separate brand positioned between Plymouth and Dodge. The idea was simple enough. Plymouth could attract buyers looking for something affordable, Dodge could sit higher, DeSoto could offer more style and equipment, and Chrysler could represent the more expensive end of the lineup. That structure made sense when the differences between the brands were clear, but by the late 1950s, things were getting complicated. Chrysler had multiple brands competing for the same customers. Cars were becoming larger and more powerful, styling was changing rapidly, and manufacturers were constantly trying to move their brands up or down the price ladder. DeSoto found itself caught right in the middle. And the 1958 Fire Sweep is a perfect example of that problem. At first glance, the car looks incredibly impressive. The 1950s were reaching one of their most extravagant points in American automotive design. Tail fins were becoming enormous, chrome was everywhere, the bodies were long and wide. The cars looked more like rolling pieces of architecture than simple transportation. The Fire Sweep fit perfectly into that world. It had the dramatic appearance people expected from a late 1950s American automobile. But underneath the styling was a much more complicated strategy. The Fire Sweep was positioned as a lower-priced DeSoto, and that's where things start to get strange. Chrysler was essentially using parts and architecture from other Chrysler Corporation cars to create a less expensive DeSoto. That allowed the company to offer a DeSoto at a lower price. It sounded logical. Give buyers a chance to own a DeSoto without paying for the more expensive models. But there was an unintended consequence. The more DeSoto moved toward the lower end of the market, the more difficult it became to justify its existence between Dodge, Chrysler, and Plymouth. That's the problem I keep coming back to. What exactly was DeSoto supposed to be? Was it a more luxurious Dodge? A cheaper Chrysler? A more stylish Plymouth? The answer was becoming increasingly unclear. And when customers don't understand why a brand exists, that's a serious problem. The fire sweep itself didn't cause all of this. It was simply caught in the middle of a strategy that was becoming harder to defend. And the timing couldn't have been worse. The American automobile market was changing. The late 1950s brought enormous cars, but not every buyer wanted one. Fuel prices, economic concerns, and changing consumer preferences were beginning to make some of these huge automobiles less attractive. Then the 1958 recession hit the American economy. Car sales fell sharply, and independent brands were particularly vulnerable. For a company like DeSoto, that was dangerous. DeSoto didn't have the same independent identity as Ford or Chevrolet. It depended heavily on Chrysler Corporation's overall strategy. If Chrysler wanted to change the lineup, DeSoto had to adapt. If Chrysler wanted to move another brand into a certain price range, DeSoto had to deal with the consequences. And that made the brand's position increasingly unstable. The fire sweep was therefore entering the market at exactly the wrong moment. It looked like a product from a confident company, but DeSoto itself was becoming less confident. That's what makes the car so fascinating. You can look at the fire sweep and see everything people associate with the late 1950s. Huge tail fins, a long body, bright chrome, a powerful-looking front end, lots of visual drama. But behind that image, DeSoto was fighting for its life, and I think that contrast makes the car much more interesting. The fire sweep also illustrates how complicated the American automobile business had become. Manufacturers were no longer simply building one type of car. They were creating entire families of brands. Each brand had to occupy a specific price range, each one had to have a distinct personality, and each one had to sell enough cars to keep the brand alive. DeSoto was increasingly struggling with that last part. The brand had a problem with identity. It also had a problem with customers. People could look at a DeSoto and wonder whether they were getting something genuinely different from a Dodge or Chrysler, and if the difference wasn't obvious, why pay more? That's a question no manufacturer wants customers asking. The fire sweep tried to solve that by offering the DeSoto name and styling at a more accessible price. But that created another problem. If you make your brand cheaper, you can attract new customers, but you can also make your existing customers wonder if the brand is still prestigious. And DeSoto was caught between those two goals. It needed more sales, but it also needed to protect its identity. Those goals were becoming harder to achieve at the same time, and the fire sweep was right in the center of that struggle. When I look at it today, I can almost imagine the showroom experience. A customer walks in and sees the fire sweep. It looks fantastic. The fins catch your attention. The chrome shines under the showroom lights. The body looks enormous. The whole car screams 1958. Then the customer looks at the price. It might seem attractive for a DeSoto, but then there's a Dodge nearby, and a Chrysler isn't far away either. Suddenly, the decision isn't as simple. The customer has to figure out what exactly makes the DeSoto worth buying, and that confusion is deadly for a brand. The strange thing is that DeSoto had actually been a successful brand for many years. It wasn't always in trouble. There were periods when the company had strong sales and a clear place in Chrysler's lineup. But by the late 1950s, the automotive market was becoming more difficult. The big three were fighting harder for every customer. Independent brands were struggling, and consumers had more choices than ever before. DeSoto needed a very strong identity to survive. Instead, its position was becoming blurred. The fire sweep was attractive, but attractiveness alone couldn't solve the larger problem. And this is where the story becomes almost tragic. It looked like the future, but the brand was running out of time. Only a few years later, DeSoto would be gone. Chrysler eventually decided there was no longer enough reason to keep the brand alive, and that meant the fire sweep became part of one of the final chapters of a company that once had a real place in the American automobile market. That's why I find the car so interesting. It's not just another 1950s finned automobile. There were plenty of those. It's a car that represents a much bigger question. What happens when a brand loses its place in the market? DeSoto had once occupied a clear position, but by the late 1950s, that position was becoming harder to explain. And once customers stop understanding what makes a brand different, sales can disappear surprisingly quickly.
The fire sweep wasn't ugly. It wasn't some ridiculous engineering experiment. It didn't look outdated when it was new. In fact, it looked incredibly modern. But a beautiful car can't save a brand if the company doesn't know where that car belongs. That's the lesson I take from the fire sweep. Chrysler was trying to make its entire lineup work as one system, but instead of creating clear separation between the brands, the boundaries were becoming increasingly blurred. DeSoto was caught between them, and eventually it couldn't survive the competition. The 1958 fire sweep therefore feels almost like a contradiction. It looks like a car from a company that should be expanding, but it was actually coming from a brand that was beginning to disappear. It looks confident. The strategy behind it wasn't. It looks expensive. It was designed partly to move DeSoto into a lower price range. It looks like the future, but for DeSoto, the future was becoming very short. And that's why I think this car deserves to be remembered. When you see those huge fins and all that chrome, it's easy to think you're simply looking at another extravagant 1950s American automobile. But once you know the story, the fire sweep becomes something completely different. It's evidence of how quickly an American automobile brand could go from being important to becoming irrelevant. And DeSoto wasn't destroyed by one terrible car. It was slowly squeezed by the changing structure of the American market and by Chrysler's own complicated brand strategy. The fire sweep was simply caught in the middle. And honestly, that's what makes it one of the most fascinating forgotten cars of the era. Because by the time people were admiring those enormous fins, DeSoto was already fighting a battle it would eventually lose. It looked like a symbol of American automotive confidence, but behind the chrome and tail fins was a brand running out of room to survive. And within only a few years, DeSoto would disappear completely.